In the early hours of May 16th, a father in Callaway County was awakened by what he believed was a gunshot outside his family home. Concerned for his family's safety, he stepped out to investigate. Blocking his driveway sat a vehicle he did not recognize. Through the rear window, in plain view, rested a fully loaded AK-47 assault rifle. Fearing that someone dangerous might still be in the area, he immediately called the police. Officers arrived quickly and found the car unlocked. Inside, they discovered a needle cap on the floorboard, evidence of possible drug use, and license plates that did not match the vehicle. When deputies ran the vehicle identification number, the return revealed something far more alarming. The car belonged to Gary Rowland, a 30-year-old parolee with multiple outstanding warrants. Rowland had been quoted saying, "I'm never going back to prison alive." Officers realized he was likely still in the neighborhood. Using CCTV footage and witness reports, they quickly tracked him to a nearby apartment complex. The arrest itself was swift and without resistance. Handcuffed and in custody, Gary was placed in a patrol car. But instead of being taken directly to jail, he began offering information about local drug and firearm trafficking in exchange for a reduced sentence. Believing they were about to secure a major break, deputies made a critical decision. They would take him to the police station for questioning. That decision, to divert to the sheriff's office instead of the county jail, would prove fatal. At the jail, Gary would have undergone a thorough intake search, a standard procedure designed to prevent exactly what was about to happen. Instead, he was escorted into an interrogation room at the police station, still handcuffed, still appearing cooperative. What the officers did not know was that the initial search at the scene of his arrest had been incomplete. Hidden in his waistband, unnoticed by anyone, were a loaded pistol and a knife. Gary Rowland had entered the building armed. Inside the interrogation room, two members of a DEA task force prepared to question him: Detective Jody Cash and his colleague, Donald Bowman. Neither man had any reason to suspect that the suspect sitting across from them was carrying a weapon. The surveillance cameras recorded their entry, their calm demeanor, their belief that they were simply conducting an interview. But there was a history in that room that Gary had not forgotten. Years earlier, Jody Cash had been the arresting officer in a case that sent Gary to prison. Now, with a gun hidden against his stomach, Gary sat face to face with the man who had put him away, and he waited. The connection between Gary Rowland and Detective Jody Cash went back to 2017. That year, Cash had arrested Gary on drug and firearms charges, a case serious enough to send him to prison for several years. For Gary, that arrest was a turning point, one he had not forgiven. For Cash, it was simply another day on the job, part of his 22 years in law enforcement. Now in the interrogation room, the two men were reunited. Gary gave no outward sign of recognition. He sat calmly, his hands cuffed in front of him, answering questions about local narcotics trafficking. He spoke in the easy language of an informant, offering names and locations, dangling information in exchange for leniency. Cash and Bowman listened, unaware that Gary had already decided he would never go back to prison, alive or otherwise. The weapon in his waistband was not a backup plan. It was the plan. Gary had been given an opportunity he never expected: to be inside a police station, armed, with the officer who had once put him behind bars. He intended to use it. But first, he needed the right moment. And he needed the officers to lower their guard completely. Gary began by asking for a cigarette. It was a small request, reasonable for a suspect who had been cooperative. Detective Cash and Deputy Bowman saw no reason to refuse. They escorted him outside the building, let him smoke, and then returned him to the interrogation room. On the surface, it was a routine break. But when Gary sat back down, surveillance footage captured a subtle movement. He pulled his right pant leg up, just below the knee. The gesture seemed casual, almost unconscious, but it was deliberate. By raising the fabric, he eliminated any obstruction that might slow his draw. The weapon in his waistband was now only a short reach away. The officers did not notice. They continued the interview, believing Gary was still their informant, still willing to trade information for a reduced sentence. He spoke about drug deals, about firearm sources, about people who could be arrested. Each word sounded credible. Each detail seemed to confirm that he was holding up his end of the bargain. But Gary was not giving them anything he had not already rehearsed. He was buying time, waiting for the moment when the officers would feel comfortable enough to make one more mistake. The interview stretched on. Gary continued to offer information, but he also continued to ask for favors. His next request was a phone call. He wanted to speak with his girlfriend, saying she could help provide the details the officers were looking for. Detective Cash and Deputy Bowman hesitated. A phone call was a greater risk than a cigarette break. But Gary pressed, insisting that the call would unlock the information they wanted. He framed it as a small accommodation that would lead to a major payoff. The officers agreed. They would allow one more trip outside, and Gary could make his call. What they did not know was that Gary had no intention of delivering any information. The request was not about cooperation. It was about positioning. He had already chosen his moment. The cigarette break had allowed him to adjust his clothing. The phone call would bring him outside again, this time with the two officers who had unknowingly given him everything he needed. The surveillance footage shows Gary standing near the entrance of the building. Deputy Bowman stood to his left. Detective Cash stood to his right. A colleague walked past them, entering for a shift change, unaware that he was walking away from the final seconds of calm. The colleague disappeared through the doorway. In that instant, Gary Rowland moved. There was no warning, no struggle, no drawn-out confrontation. In one motion, he pulled the loaded pistol from his waistband and fired at point-blank range. Detective Jody Cash was struck. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet of the early morning. Other officers responded immediately. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Gary was hit 12 times and collapsed on the pavement. When the shooting stopped, the focus shifted to the fallen detective. Radio traffic captured the chaos. "We got one officer down. It was in his waistband. Go to Jody first." Officers rushed to Cash, applying pressure, calling for medical support, doing everything they could to keep him alive. An ambulance arrived within minutes. Jody Cash was transported to a hospital in critical condition, but the damage was too severe. The 22-year veteran, a husband and father who had spent his career with the Callaway County Sheriff's Office and the last 2 years on a DEA task force, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His colleagues were left standing outside the same building where they had begun the night, now marked by tragedy. When investigators later examined the weapon Gary Rowland had used, they found a detail that may have saved additional lives. The pistol had jammed. A casing remained lodged in the chamber, preventing a second shot from being fired. In the seconds after Gary shot Jody Cash, multiple officers returned fire. Gary was struck 12 times. If the pistol had not malfunctioned, he might have been able to fire again before being taken down. The jammed casing was a mechanical failure, a random break that likely prevented further casualties. But for Jody Cash, that break came too late. The investigation that followed focused on how a handcuffed felon had been able to bring a loaded weapon into a law enforcement facility. The answer was stark. No one had searched him thoroughly enough. The initial pat-down at the scene of his arrest had missed the pistol in his waistband. From that moment, the chain of events was set. Gary had used the officers' trust against them, turning small allowances, a cigarette, a phone call, into opportunities to prepare for what he had planned from the beginning. In the months following Jody Cash's death, his wife, Karen Cash, along with Deputy Donald Bowman, filed a lawsuit against the law enforcement agencies involved. The suit sought wrongful death damages for Jody's estate and compensation for the emotional trauma Bowman had suffered. Bowman had been standing just feet away when Gary opened fire. He survived physically, but the psychological damage was permanent. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder and could no longer work in law enforcement. The lawsuit argued that protocol had failed at multiple points. The incomplete search, the decision to bring a high-risk suspect to a police station instead of a jail, and the granting of unnecessary freedoms to a man who had publicly declared he would never return to prison. In September 2023, a settlement was reached. While the financial terms were not made public, the settlement itself served as an acknowledgement that the system had broken down. Karen Cash would never see her husband again. Donald Bowman would never return to the career he had dedicated his life to. Gary Rowland died on the pavement outside the sheriff's office, shot 12 times in the exchange of gunfire that followed his attack on Jody Cash. He was 30 years old. In the days after, investigators pieced together his movements leading up to that morning. He had been wanted on multiple warrants. He had made his intentions known to anyone who would listen. He was not going back to prison alive. When officers found him at the apartment complex, he had already prepared. The weapon in his waistband was not a spontaneous choice. He had hidden it before the arrest, knowing that a rushed search might miss it. The incomplete search proved him right. In the interrogation room, he had played the role of a cooperative informant perfectly, smoking, talking, asking for small favors. Each request was a test, and each time the officers accommodated him, he gained confidence. When the final moment came, he acted without hesitation. His death did not come from a prison cell or a courtroom. It came exactly where he had chosen, outside a law enforcement building, having taken the life of the officer who had once sent him away. Jody Cash served 22 years in law enforcement. He was remembered by colleagues as a dedicated investigator, a man who took dangerous criminals off the streets and worked to protect his community. His death was not the result of a high-risk raid or a chase. It came during what should have been a routine interview, outside a building where he should have been safe. The investigation concluded that the failure was procedural, a search that was not thorough enough, followed by decisions that gave a violent man the opportunity he needed. For Karen Cash, for Donald Bowman, and for everyone who worked alongside Jody, the loss was irreplaceable. The settlement in 2023 brought some measure of accountability, but no legal outcome could restore what was taken. Gary Rowland's words, "I'm never going back to prison alive," turned out to be true. But he did not simply escape incarceration. He ensured that his name would be remembered for the life he ended, not the one he lived. Jody Cash's death stands as a reminder that in law enforcement, the most dangerous moment is often the one that feels the safest.